Hello, listeners! We are absolutely chuffed you've decided to join us. Grab a packet of biscuits, brew a warm cuppa, and curl up for a wholesome American conversation about quintessential British food from everyone's favourite baking competition. Please enjoy! Hats off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast.
Off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast. My name is Malory, and I am here with my friend Nick. As always, we'll be talking about the signature, technical, and showstopper challenge of episode 8 from Collection 1, Series 5 of the Great British Bake Off, and we'll be discussing our versions and our takes on the challenges that the bakers faced, and learning about the history of my favorite food, donuts. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before. Donuts are my favorite food. Hands down. I love all food.
Is there a history to why you love donuts so much?
No, they're just so good. Do I need a reason? They're amazing.
I mean, having made them, I can say no, you don't need any reason because they're perfect.
They're perfect.
I don't know if we can say that about the other two bakes in this particular episode. I care so much less about them, but they're still beautiful.
I am now obsessed with Povitica, and I hope to get you obsessed with it as well.
Yes.
But yeah, fruit loaves as the signature challenge.
This was a weird episode.
I just am not that thrilled about fruit bread.
I mean, I get it. We've got pies. Pies are good. They're fruit and bread, basically. But, I don't want it in, a loaf. I can't even think of a good, analogy of other bakes that we would put fruit into a loaf.
When I think of fruit bread, I think of, a delicious cranberry walnut bread, or maybe a stollen. I feel like everything that I think of that I would really enjoy eating is kind of boring. That being said, though, watching the bakers and seeing what they came up with, there were definitely some things that I found inspiring. And here's what I took out of this challenge. First of all, Nancy's microwave theory. That whole thing was really cool. So regardless of the end product being boring fruit loaves, the fact that she thought to use the microwave to shorten her proof time when they didn't give them that much time for an enriched bread dough.
Let's talk about that real quick.
Okay.
They were asked to make a free-form, sweet or enriched fruit-filled loaf in 2.5 hours, which I think might be physically impossible. I looked up a recipe for Paul's regular enriched dough, which in itself takes 3.5 hours, so I have no clue what they were expecting the bakers to do in 2.5 hours.
I think very much exactly what they were expecting them to do with the Povitica technical as well. I think the goal of the short times this week was to really see if the bakers understood when to sacrifice proving time versus when to sacrifice baking time. I think they knew going in that they were going to have either a slightly underproved or slightly underbaked result, and we're just curious what the bakers would do with that. That being said, yikes.
I mean, yes, you do make a good point. It's kind of that idea of so when we go into the technical challenge, when they start making the Povitica, it's the exact same time. Those people who understood making that time work for their enriched dough, if they can make it work for the Povitica, it's a good comparison. But that was a complete coincidence, I think.
Yeah, well, and it really helped Chetna too, because she got to do the very nearly a very similar challenge to what she had to do that morning, because her fruit-filled loaf that she chose was very much inspired by the Povitica, and it was, I think, had also dates in it as well, and was a little bit more free form in that it was sort of a bunch of smaller rolls rather than one big roll looped around.
I have written in my notes, Povitica inspired. Any other favorites of yours?
I really did think Richard's looked really good. I love that, the pecan and the fruit tea ring. I thought that looked appealing and interesting. I don't know. What about you? I'm left feeling fairly neutral about this one.
I mean, totally same. I kind of liked the look and the sound of a lot of them. Louis' cherry tree was certainly interesting, something I hadn't seen before. Little brandy sugar cubes, which, I don't know, I'd love to bite into a little bread roll and find just a pool of molten sugar in there. How can you go wrong? It's very much the Queen Amman style of you bite in, you have that hot sugar on the inside. And of course, it looks a lot prettier than just a braid or something. It's like an image.
Yeah.
It definitely shows off the free-form bread thing.
Yeah. So that being said, with all of our neutral feelings taken into account, if you were in the tent that day, what would you have made for this fruit loaf?
Well, I'm sitting here looking at our slideshow and being just very inspired by your fruit loaf, but mine was just, I was looking and looking and looking. Oh my God, dear listener. If you look up fruit loaf in America, you cannot find anything. It is all banana bread, and that is it.
Did you Google European fruit bread and European fruit loaf?
I don't know if I added European as a keyword, but like
It helps a
any
ton.
variation of fruit and loaf and bread just came up with more variations on banana bread. So the one recipe I found that looked at least interesting, and I'm not even sure if this is a bread or a cake, I found a recipe for a blueberry babka, which uses yeast, so I think it's a bread, and it sounds like a good idea, kind of along the same lines of the Povitica, but...
Yeah, Kate did that for her yeasted cake, so it really kind of walks that fine line, right?
I mean, going back to our episode when we talked about bread versus cake, we said there has to be yeast in it.
For it to be bread.
Babka is still in a weird space.
Yeah. How would you flavor it? You said blueberry?
Kind of like a blueberry muffin, because that's something that I grew up on, with blueberry muffins with like crystallized sugar on top, and like that's a classic taste to me. But you could definitely decorate it with all kinds of like crumbles or icings or all kinds of you could add other flavors to it. I know blueberry and lemon is something that like they like to do a lot, but you kind of run into the idea of one flavor drowning out another one.
No, lemon and blueberry always go really well together, I think.
So it's I think a classic, and if you could do it really well and make it look really beautiful, I think it would have been totally fine. It is the 8th episode of the season, so maybe they're looking for something a little bit more intense than a babka. It would have to be freeform, and I think babkas are normally in a loaf tin, so...
Yeah, I was going to ask you that.
I'm looking, there are a few really pretty pictures of like a freeform, kind of just like a braided
plait.
babka.
Yeah.
It's just basically a braided plait, exactly what it is.
Yeah, when I was thinking about this challenge, I was thinking a lot about plaits as well.
It looks so good. Oh, God, now I need to make this.
Do it.
It looks really good. Anyway, you were saying?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about plaits as like a presentation, from a presentation standpoint. I've been making a lot of sourdough recently, and so I'm pretty familiar with a freeform no tin loaf, but they aren't beautiful as much as they are rustic. And so I think plait's kind of something that I think can look so pretty if you like just increase the number of strands that you're working with, but doesn't like make it any harder.
So what was your fruit loaf?
So I was thinking about what types of fruit I would want in a bread and trying to make it anything that wasn't cranberry, because cranberry is my favorite. And I ended up going with something and also cranberry. But I thought it would be really interesting.
I think you did cranberry a couple episodes ago anyway, Malory.
I know, I did the cranberry orange black sesame rye rolls, and I was like, I need to change it up. I can't just keep doing cranberry. And so I came up with maybe like a mulled cider inspired fruit loaf. So you could put a lot of the spices, get them toasted, grind them, and then use them to flavor the dough itself, and then stuffed with like apple pieces, maybe some cranberries, and then covered it in orange glaze. And I thought that would be interesting.
That sounds pretty spectacular.
Really? Okay, that's good. I'm glad I needed that. Thank you.
I think the only problem you'd have to worry about is however you put the apples into the bread. Would it like ooze or would it like caramelize?
Yeah.
Probably either one is totally fine.
Yeah, I was trying to think if I would just like chop them up and have like, I'd probably cook them a little bit because they're so full of moisture, cook them down and just have like apple chunks in there. Or if I wanted to make some sort of like applesaucey jammy thing with like the apples and maybe some oranges and cranberries and have that almost like filling every strand. It's sort of like Martha did.
Sounds really good, actually. I'm proud of you for that one because I could only think of the one thing. So I was like, I don't know. Moving on to another technical bake, the one you made, Povitica.
Yay! I want to get your impression of it before I dig in because I've accidentally fallen in love with it, but none of our bakers really did, and it was a nightmare to achieve in the 2.5 hours that they had.
Obviously, Chetna had a great first day, having done the Povitica inspired one and then the actual Povitica, and she had a great first day, but this sounds like a heck of a challenge. And even the filling, where every baker had some weird problem trying to spread the filling, I know I would go crazy if I had to try to figure that one out. It sounds like a very good and very tasty recipe, kind of very similar to the babka, but I've never had one and I can barely roll out dough like bread dough. I can't imagine trying to stretch that dough so thin.
You can't see me. I'm smiling. I'm very excited. So I was so worried after seeing our bakers really struggle with it. Obviously, Chetna came in first, and she herself said that if she had come in anything other than first, it would have been a little bit embarrassing. We saw Martha come last, and everybody else struggle with some combination of either underbakedness or underproofness. I think pretty much everybody proved for too long and then didn't have enough time left to bake, because once you fill something that much, like Povitica is pretty much absolutely stuffed full with walnut filling by the end of it, and so it really needs a long time to dry out, and so if you don't give it that, it will be underdone. All that being said, I will say I both looked this up and found the BBC recipe online to base mine off of, and then I also went back and I watched the masterclass, because in the masterclass episode, I think it's episode 4, Paul shows you how he makes it. His BBC recipe does not say bread flour, it just says plain flour. His masterclass episode, he specifically asked Mary to pour him some strong bread flour. And this got me thinking, I don't know if the bakers were given bread flour or plain flour, but I think the gluten content makes the difference. So I used bread flour, which has a higher gluten content.
Yep.
Which makes the dough significantly more stretchy, even with all of the butter and the milk that's going into it.
Okay.
So it was actually really, really easy for me to roll out as thin as I needed it to. Like, obviously, you just keep working, but the stretchiness made it a lot more resistant to tearing. And so I had a pretty good time. You use a lot of flour. Obviously, you're making sure it doesn't get stuck to the table, but as long as it's not getting stuck, it wasn't too hard to roll out. And then I found out later that I actually forgot to apply the butter to the middle. So the idea is that you roll out this giant sheet of dough and then you put melted butter on it. Then you cover it with the walnut cocoa mixture. I accidentally...
So this is the part that the bakers really struggled with.
Yeah.
And so you accidentally did what?
I accidentally just left the butter off. And I don't know if this was the defining factor or not, but I will make it again. So I'll keep you posted if it was the butter that made it harder. So I actually left my mixture fairly chunky, pretty similar to the texture that Louis left his, because I also wanted some bites of almonds that's not the nut that's in there. I wanted some bites of the walnuts and just to have that nice crunchy texture in there. And I knew that I could take my time and that this didn't have to be placed in front of Paul and Mary. So I was willing to take the risk. Just spreading it out. I mean, it wasn't hard. It was fine. It just took some love. Paul suggests that if the mixture gets too thick while you're sitting, just like put a little touch of more warm milk in it just to sort of loosen it back up. And in the masterclass episode, he also recommends that you just like take some time. And so that's what I did. I just sort of sprinkled it all out with my hands and then slowly moved it around, stretched it a little bit, and was able to get a really even spread that I was really happy with. So that was fine. I honestly got nervous because I was like, this is going too well. Everybody made this seem so hard. But I honestly think really the hard part was the time limit. The filling, I think everybody overthought it and got nervous about it because the dough was so thin. And also it could be the fact that they might have been using plain flour and not bread flour. So they didn't have the same sort of resistance and stretchiness that I had with my dough. But Paul's recipe asks for you to proof the dough for 1 hour before filling, 1 hour after filling, and then bake for an hour.
Excuse you, Paul.
Yeah. And it takes you 10 minutes to put the dough together in the first place because you have to whip it because it's enriched, or not whip it, but you mix it for a fairly long time to really get it incorporated and glossy. And then it takes at least 10 minutes for the rolling and filling process. So that's 3.5 hours.
That's what I wrote down. Paul's enriched dough takes 3.5 hours. So.
Yeah, so the Povitica as a whole takes that long. So you really just you're cutting out an entire hour somewhere. And I feel like Chetna made the right choice in that sacrifice needs to come from the proving time. But a lot of other people took that out of the baking time. And I think that's where everybody faltered.
As you know, I never bake something without a recipe. I always try to follow it to the letter as much as I can. And then slowly I'm getting better at improvising. But looking at all those bakers being like, I'm sure it'll bake in like 15 minutes. You're like, what are you doing? Are you crazy? But only because you know more than they do about how long it should take. So watching the bakers, you're like, oh no, God, why do you do this to yourself?
Yeah.
I can't believe any of them even had like semi-presentable bread to show them. That could have gone so
yeah,
south.
It's so true. And I guess I'm thinking back to the Kugelhop that I made, baked in 30 minutes. And I remember being so surprised by that, but I think it was because it had a big hole in the middle for the tin shape. But yeah, anything in that size of a tin, and especially when you're dealing with a wet interior, that's going to take you at least 45 minutes. And it was baked at a fairly low temperature. So 350 for 15 minutes and then 300 for another 45. And even when I pulled mine out of the oven, it was completely baked through, but could have used maybe another 5 to 10 minutes just to get it a little bit more springier to the touch.
And imagine how much longer it would have taken if you had included that butter in there, just be even more liquid, vying for time to bake.
Exactly.
Well, I'm so glad it turned out well.
I'm obsessed with it. I'm making another one. And what's fun about it, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, so I'm a quarter Croatian. That sounds silly to say.
Cool.
But really the only family ties to that part of the family that I have is my last name. And this Christmas cookie that my grandma sort of like gets a whole family together pretty much every year to bake for Christmas. And we call them nut horns, and I'm sure they have a different name that I don't know, but they're basically little walnut rolls.
I've never heard of them.
Yeah, I'm literally have looked up recipes for them. They don't exist. I can't find anything similar even. Like I can find walnut rolls, but not prepared in the way that we prepare them. And so they are basically, we roll out a dough really thin and then fill it, put a little bit of walnut filling in it, roll it up kind of like a filled croissant, bake it, and then dump it in powdered sugar. They're amazing. They're so good. I like just binge eat them like potato chips all during the holidays. But what I thought was really intriguing, so this challenge is a Croatian challenge. I think the bake itself might have originated in Slovenia, but I think it was Croatian people who were like in Slovenia at the time. I'll have to double check the Wikipedia article about that. But when I was reading the Wikipedia article, it said that the filling included like a clotted cheese. If you think about like cottage cheese, it has a small like clots in it. Why it was so fascinating for me to hear that was because one of the things that makes these Christmas cookies really unique is that the dough that we use to roll it out has cottage cheese in it. And so that in place of like butter gives it those little sort of molecules of fat that then create steam when it's baking. And so even though it's rolled out really thin, the cottage cheese just like provides that layer of fat. So we didn't include it in the filling, we included it in the dough. But I just thought it was like crazy that there was this other Croatian bake that was like basically an enormous walnut roll that also historically had cottage cheese in it. Now, none of the recipes I could find today had that. It was only the Wikipedia article that mentioned that historically it used to have that. So I don't know what happened along the history train there, but I just thought that was really, really cool.
I think between you and I and Hot Bo Pod, we can bring that back. But I love that last week we learned about your name. This time we learned about your origin. This is great. This is growth.
I know. This is just a really surprising little chunk of Croatian history that I never thought I would get.
You will have to find a way to make them without nuts because I can't eat walnuts.
Yeah, I'll definitely, you could really do pretty much the same thing and fill it with, you could do chopped up chocolate. Yeah, I think I'm going to add cinnamon to mine next time. It doesn't call for it, but
a
little bit of cinnamon. Yeah, it's just cocoa powder. But I think adding a little bit of cinnamon to it would be perfect. You could really fill it with chopped whatever and have something very similar.
We'll let you know, listeners, when we come up with the next big Povitica.
We say that all the time. We're going to need to start writing down a list of everything that we've promised our listeners we're going to bake again because it's turning... I don't know.
Every episode? Yeah.
I know. Every episode we're like, we're going to make this 5 more times and we'll make sure to keep you tuned in to what happens. And I don't think we're ever going to achieve all of them.
Hey, we'll have some bonus episodes further down the line at some point, I'm sure.
Yeah, we'll have to just
Hey, listeners, if we mention something, write it down or something so we can learn it.
We should be doing that. That's not their job. That's our job. We're the ones making this podcast.
You expect me to remember what I said 6 episodes ago? No,
we'll just
never
have to
happening.
re-listen to all of them and write it down.
Oh, God, my worst nightmare, listening to myself. I need something to drink because I've talked for a while. Do you have any tea with you today?
I have a roasted dandelion root tea, which I'm loving.
Whoa,
I know. I love me a good herbal tea.
That sounds awful.
It's
but
so
it
good.
Sounds so classy.
Oh my gosh, no. It is a lovely... A lot of people use it like a coffee alternative just because it's got that sort of nice bitter earthy flavor to it. It's like roasty and delicious. I love it. It's one of my favorite teas.
I'll try it someday. I'll probably hate it, but I'll try it.
Yeah, that's fair. That's allowed.
I do have a shout out to one listener. They replied to our most recent email, which if you're not on Instagram, or if you're not on Facebook, or et cetera, feel free to reply to our emails or send us an email at hotbopod@gmail.com if you so desire. Marie Fernandez says, I'm going to bake or fry ricotta donuts tomorrow. Nice, light, and moist with a touch of rum. which I looked up ricotta donuts. They sound so yummy. I'll have to try them out sometime.
I've never heard of that.
And thanks for listening, Marie. Happy baking. So my time for tea question for you today, Malory, if you haven't already seen it, is what does a nun's fart smell like?
I did see this while you were prepping the slideshow, and I literally could not figure out if it, like, I'm assuming it's obviously a joke, but is it, like, I just got really nervous about it. I was like, this question could be anything, and a nun's fart smells like, I don't know.
I'll give you a hint. It probably smells very good.
What?
And no, it's not a joke.
What?
I mean, well, it's sort of a joke, but there's no punchline.
These things always throw me off. I don't know. I would guess that it smells like most other people's farts. I'm really thrown off by this.
So a nun's fart is not smelly. It is instead a dessert pastry of fried dough.
Oh my God. Why would they call it that?
Okay, so there's two different variations of this, also known as nun's puffs, with a very fanciful story that you can look up on your own. But basically, a pet de nun, or nun's fart.
Oh, God.
It's a little dollop of fried dough that's light and airy and covered in powdered sugar, and is one of literally so many variations of fried dough across the world.
Wow.
How many variations of fried dough can you think of? Fully broad. Last week we talked about, this is what I was really excited about before we started the call. Last week we talked about fried dough versus, what'd you call it? Elephant ear.
Oh, yeah. Fried dough, elephant ear. There's another one that's like funnel cake.
Funnel cake, yep.
I think of just like general donuts. Churros are like one of my other favorite foods. Fried dough really is just so wonderful. I'm sure there are so many more. Like filled ones, like we saw a lot of people like fry their samosas. So many. I'm overwhelmed by the number, in fact.
You should be overwhelmed because I think almost every culture in the entire planet probably has a variation of a fried dough. From France and New Orleans, you have beignets or beignets. Greece has a lucumades. I'm going to say all these names wrong. Italy is zeppole or strafoli. So papillas, funnel cake. Croatia has a krofni. Turkey has a tulumba. West Africa has an akara. The list goes on and on and on and on. And for a fun fact for us, in Canada, fried dough or an elephant ear might be called a beaver's tail.
I think I knew that.
There's actually a brand of fried dough places called beaver's tail. So
wow.
In Canada, they would be even more confused by elephant ear and fried dough. But fried dough unites us as a global citizen. There is a brilliant article by Jill Van Gin, something like that, from Eat Magazine in Canada. And she talks about how the world of fried dough brings us together. And it's a very lovely article. And I got a lot of my information from her. And I think fried dough and cultural fried dough is the beginning of my history of donuts, your favorite food and kind of the world's favorite food. Let's go way, way back to the beginning of frying dough, back to a very similar place we've been to several times this season.
Is it ancient Egypt?
No.
Oh, dang it. Is it
So close.
France?
Keep going.
No, now I'll sound stupid.
It's Greece.
Oh, Greece was actually going to be my next one. I'm not lying, I promise.
So trying to find the history of frying foods was unbelievably hard, mostly because it all happened thousands upon thousands of years ago. What I could find was that frying probably first started around the time pottery was first created, because it meant you could put oil in a jar and heat it up
yep. Mm-hmm.
and have a fried something. Any kind of dish you could fry oil in probably is how it started. As early back as Greece is probably the first culture to have fried in olive oil. While others suggest maybe Japan well before then. So somewhere around 5 to 1000 BC was when we started frying things. And probably around the same time when we started frying breads. So let's go to the 1st century AD, a book that I mentioned before called Apicius, which is a list of recipes and cultural history from around that time in Rome. Would you believe it if I told you the Romans were the first people to eat French toast?
Huh. Yeah, I mean, if you told me, yeah, I would believe that, but I definitely wouldn't have been my first guess.
I mean, it makes you wonder why it's French toast, but we'll get to that some other day. I
read something about that a while ago, but that's unrelated.
Number 296 in Apicius lists another sweet dish, break fine white bread, crust removed, into rather large pieces, which soak in milk, fry in oil, cover with honey, and serve. That is almost to a T French toast.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's kind of the beginning of frying bread, but we've had them for hundreds and thousands of years. There's other variations of this, but I can only find secondary sources for them, so we'll go with that one because I could find a legitimate primary source for that. And if you want to know more about the history of donuts than I can give you in this particular podcast, I highly recommend this book where I get a lot of my next data from. It is called The Donut: History, Recipes, and Lore from Boston to Berlin by Michael Crandall. I just ordered this book. I wish I had found it months ago. It is so cool. In his very first chapter, The Holy Donut, Crandall discusses several other donuts from around the world and their religious importance.
Oh.
Yep. So we're going to talk about a little bit about why fried dough probably started out as kind of a religious thing.
Huh.
So around a similar time, the beginning of the millennium, actually I think it's 2nd century BC, so a little further back, we have the miracle of Hanukkah. So the whole story about the oil that could have lasted only about a day lasted 8 days. Today, Jewish people eat latkes and, I'm going to say it wrong, sufganiyot. Do you know any better than I do?
I came from a distinctly non-Jewish community, so I know very few.
But do you know what it is?
No, I have no idea.
Basically, they eat a jelly-filled donut.
Oh, amazing.
So Hanukkah is filled with fried food because specifically it's not the potato or the bread that's important, but it's the oil that's religiously important.
Wow,
and
okay.
so frying things makes it important to that culture.
Okay, that's cool.
One fun fact I learned from this, though, is that latkes were popular and they were made at home. But donuts didn't come into the scene until about the 1920s when bakers were trying to find commercial products that they could sell during this time.
Mm-hmm.
Fried donuts are very important for the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. Similarly, in Hinduism, the cow is sacred, so ghee is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
According to Hindu legend, the gods fished ambrosia, the nectar of immortality, out of a primordial ocean of roiling ghee.
Huh.
So as Crandall says, I take that to mean that the food of the gods is essentially a donut. Admittedly, I have not found a Swami to confirm my supposition. And I think that's the greatest line from the first 10 pages of that book.
That's awesome.
One last bit of religious importance that I can relate to a little closer, because I grew up in a Catholic family, is Carnival. Carnival marks the days before Lent, when you're supposed to give up quite a lot of things, really, and you're fasting for about 40 days. And you might know this time as Mardi Gras or Fat Tuesday. I learned Mardi Gras literally means Greasy Tuesday because it was a time when you could indulge in greasy, fatty, delicious foods before you had to go on a 40-day fasting. So what would they do? They had a bunch of hog fat from the winter months. Instead of making plain or boring breads, they would fry their breads in pig fat and they would celebrate Carnival before Lent. And so fried dough was firmly cemented in the European worldview at that point. Let's bring it back to America because nowadays you might say something as an American as apple pie, but I'd say a donut's pretty high up there in what is properly American. Donuts, as I said, come from all around the world. Every culture had some. And most commonly, you'll find that the Dutch are the ones who are said to have brought the donut to America, or at least what we now think of as a donut.
Okay, interesting.
They had what were called oliekoekjes or oliekoeks. Which meant
oil cake, right?
Oil cake. There we go. Good job. Yeah. We talked about the koekje back in I think the biscuit episode, actually. Oil cakes were these small blobs of like a batter-like dough, and they weren't the only ones to have them in New Amsterdam, aka New York. English versions of it came to New England, and they had their own versions of donuts for a long time. But this oliekoek was the epitome of like new and interesting and delicious in New York at that time. So it developed from there. They started adding eggs and they started adding butter, and it became more and more an enriched dough over time. So how a donut got its whole is a whole other story.
LOL. Thank you.
You're welcome. Actually, I labeled my history of donuts. The history of donuts is full of holes.
Oh, amazing.
Mostly because as I was looking for the history of this, I found okay, we've had donuts for years. Okay, America. And I was like, you just skipped thousands of years. What are you talking about? So I had to do a lot of research to find all the extra interesting information.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about the donut hole. There are several stories that explain why a donut has a hole. The least interesting, but the most likely, is that a hole, like your Kugelhopf, has a hole in the middle so it cooks faster.
Yeah,
So
and more evenly.
as you introduce eggs and butter and things that retard the dough, the middle of a fried donut doesn't cook quite as easily. And so if you put a hole in the middle, it cooks all the way around on both sides, and it just cooks better and faster.
There's probably a benefit for it to cook faster too, because it's such a sweetened dough. All of those things that you're adding in to enrich it are also making it much more liable to burn. So there's even more benefit for getting it out of the oil quickly.
Exactly. However, there is a far more interesting story that stars Elizabeth and Hanson Gregory of New England. Elizabeth Gregory made every version of this story I heard had this exactly as a wicked deep-fried oleocook. Whether it was actually an oleocook is unlikely because oleocook was more of a batter. But basically, she made a really great donut, a wicked donut, as us Bostonians would say. Her son was a ship's captain, and he brought in spices on his ship. So she would use nutmeg and cinnamon plus candied lemon rind and make a really delicious donut. So Hanson Gregory's ship and his crew loved these donuts and had them on their ship plenty of times. And then this is where the legend kind of falls apart. So these sound like a delicious, actually, donut, lemon and nutmeg and cinnamon.
Yeah, and spices.
So one story says that she would put nuts in the middle where it wouldn't cook all the way through. So it would fill in the middle. And either that's where we get donut from, or he didn't like nuts, so he punched out the middle, thus making a circular donut. A second story says that basically when Hanson started making them himself, he used less dough by punching out the middle, so he'd be saving on dough. But the most interesting story of all was that in a particularly troublesome storm, he had to stay near the steering wheel, whatever you want to call that.
The helm.
There we go. And he had to use both hands. So instead, he skewered the donut onto one of the spokes of the helm and thus created the first donut hole. Which, how that tracks, I don't understand, because that sounds very unhelpful.
Was he doing something else, donut in hand? Somebody yells, "There's an iceberg," and then he has to run over, take the helm, and doesn't want to drop said donut from his cherished mother, whom he might never see again? Is that what we're expected to believe? I think
so. He just needed both hands on the steering wheel, so he skewered it on top of one of the spokes.
I just can't imagine an emergency. Okay, actually, maybe I could, because as I said, donuts are my favorite food.
But also, if you're turning the steering wheel, it's just gonna fall off anyway.
Yeah.
You have to turn the boat in a hurry. It's just gonna fall, so it doesn't make any sense. But that's a beautiful story that people talk about all the time.
LOL. I think I have heard it, but if I have, it was so long ago that I'd forgotten pretty much all of it.
And so we move on past the donut hole into commercial donuts. Donuts today have become a fast food staple. They're quick and fast and easy, and sometimes if they're made well, absolutely delicious.
Sometimes.
And donuts came into their own at the beginning of the 20th century. So, as much as I hate to say it, we have the World Wars and machines to thank for donuts today.
Wait, this is a weird fact that I think I do know. Wasn't that a way to raise morale of the soldiers overseas? Okay, I thought that was a thing that I knew and I wanted to share it.
So, first off, I'm going to mention a Jewish immigrant from Russia named Adolf Levitt. In 1920, created the first donut making machine. It was called the Wonderful Almost Human Automatic Donut Machine, and it could produce 80 dozen donuts every hour.
Wow.
which I misread and thought it said 80 donuts an hour. And I was like, well, still, like, that's pretty cool for a automatic donut machine. 80 donuts, that's pretty cool. 80 dozen is nearly 1,000 donuts an hour.
Wow. Is that just punching it out, or is it like
No, it was a whole rigmarole. Like, if you've ever been to Krispy Kreme, the whole
yeah, like
idea
a
of like
Krispy Kreme contraption?
it mixes the dough and it cuts it out and it fries it and it like throws in like sugar and like this whole automatic process.
Wow.
And so 1920s was a time when people loved that kind of stuff, and so it became a sensation and it became a spectacle to watch.
Honestly, still is. Like, I remember, like, as a kid going to Krispy Kreme, getting your free donut, and like like staring nose to the glass at all of the donuts being made.
At the Chicago World's Fair in 1934, donuts were touted as the food hit of the century of progress, and people would line up to watch donuts being made in one of Levitt's machines. Also, he became a millionaire off of this product.
Seems reasonable.
And soon his business spread across the entire country. In 1 year, made $25 million off of his donut machine.
In a year?
In a year, I believe, yes.
Wow.
I'm not sure if it was... Well, it became a huge business. He produced not just the machines and sold the machines to people. He made donuts and shipped them to different bakers. He made his own line of donut shops. He became very successful because people loved donuts. And why did we love donuts? For the exact reason you mentioned. In World War I, the American Salvation Army gave out donuts and coffee to American soldiers overseas. And so these donut girls would make donuts in the Salvation Army tents, and the World War I veterans loved it. While they were there, they felt that they were having a little taste of home. When they came back, all they wanted was donuts. And so the donut explosion came out of that, and Mr. Levitt helped that.
Wow.
And so that was so successful in World War I that in World War II, the Red Cross joined in, and they started producing service clubs near American bases in England. And actually, if you are a listener from Great Britain and got a chance to watch the first season of Bake Off, Sue Perkins does a whole episode, a little like history section about this.
That's how I know it. That's where I learned this from, was the beginnings Great British Bake Off. Wow. It really does all come around, doesn't it? That's so funny.
She does a great section about this. But to reiterate what she says, they made these service clubs. They hired smart, cheerful, and pretty American women who were hired to supply donuts, conversation, and general joy to the American soldiers. Yeah, yikes. I am extrapolating from that interview, but basically they had to be like cheerful all the time. They had to be smart, and they were often well educated, so they would converse with the American soldiers, and just generally they had to always look pretty and made up. But they were incredibly helpful in helping soldiers feel a little bit of normality in the middle of World War II. So I'll say they did a pretty good job. They even converted buses and trucks to make club mobiles, and they would send them out across France or across the European continent to supply donuts to people on the front lines. And they even joined with tanks and army trucks in the invasion of France in June 1944. So they were incredibly important to these soldiers. So this is where you'll have heard of donut lassies, or I believe the Red Cross coined them as donut dollies, which alliteration is fun, so that works.
Wow.
And as you said, they were incredibly good at morale boosting.
Wow. Yeah, I can only imagine, like, they're one of my sad foods. I think just something about the sweetness and the yeastiness, they're just so calming. And so I can only imagine that when you're at literal war and feeling far away from home and your family, that would just be everything you want in that moment.
A little sense of normalcy. Also, evidently this is so successful that the American Salvation Army would greet people arriving at Ellis Island with blankets and donuts.
And racism.
And general racism,
Sorry,
yes. But
who said that? What?
What? I kind of knew you'd bring that up, but yes.
I just have to. I'm not letting the America get away with any of its bullshit.
But evidently, that's one of the first things they saw when coming to America was donuts. National Donut Day, actually, the first Friday in June, so we just missed it.
Oh,
but
dang
I hope you all...
Why didn't you tell me?
I thought you would have known.
Why would I know that?
I
I
hope
don't
you all
know.
had a delicious and lovely donut day.
Oh my God.
It celebrates those donut girls in the First World War.
Cannot believe I missed it.
I'm sorry, Mallory.
An excuse to eat a donut.
It's really sad because you're far away still. I couldn't bring you any of my donuts.
I know, it was tragic. You'll have to make more when I'm there. We'll add it onto our list of things that we're promising to bake again.
Should I write this down? Hold on, I need to write this down now. We said we would. Things we say we'll bake. So we had, what was the thing we just talked about? Povitica. We'll make Povitica again.
Povitica. I am 100% that is something I will make again.
Donuts again. And then hopefully someone will let me know what else I've said in the past. Going back to history of donuts. 2 more quick things. Doughnut. There's again a lot of speculation about where this word came from. It's been used back and forth across the decades.
The centuries.
The centuries. The 18th century, the 19th century. It's all over the place.
Wow.
The ones I found that I thought were most likely. So there was the donut in the Gregory story that had actual nuts on the inside. That's possible because there were nuts or there were fruits inside these donuts a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It also may refer to the outdated definition of a nut being a lump or a small rounded cake or cookie. So the Oya cake where you had little donut dumplings, basically, that was probably a reason why I was called a nut, because it was a little small lump of dough. And then the donut that we know in America, D-O-N-U-T, is a wholly American invention. It is known as a donut with a UGH pretty much in the rest of the world, but donuts with O is very American. It either comes from just kind of general laziness across the decades, maybe a little bit of like rebellion from traditional European spellings, like a lot of America is, or it was a sales technique for immigrants that they could pronounce the word better, because obviously D-O-U-G-H is a very strange word. But
yeah, maybe.
They were hoping to sell the donut making machine, and so they made it into a donut machine.
Regardless of why, it definitely seems like a very marketing standpoint. Like, rather than people just like choosing to spell it shorter, it definitely seems like a very capitalist American thing to be like, and now we spell it this other way because it's catchier and more people will buy it.
It's shorter. It looks new and fun. It makes sense. From across the world to America, donuts are well beloved, and you now know where they came from. We saw some very interesting, very delicious looking donuts in the tent.
Oh, so true. And it's interesting that I'm kind of glad that they were a showstopper. Last week we had eclairs. This week was donuts. It's interesting. I feel like showstoppers tend to be these really enormous, gigantic bakes. And then entremets is next week.
Ugh.
Yeah, I know. I'm not doing that big. We can nose goes that one.
I really want to make an entremet, but I'm so scared.
Oh, absolutely not. Nothing could make me. But we have all these like really tiny, really delicate bakes being the showstopper, which I think is just really interesting and not normally what we see for showstoppers. So I loved that. And I do think it's just like really interesting to have their showstopper be dependent upon frying dough and frying it evenly and getting it filled right. Because frying is just tricky. It's a lot faster. You really have to be careful about like what temperature your oil is at. It just gets a lot more finicky.
You already saw Kate kind of struggle with the fryer, so God only knows those bakers were eyeing it very strongly.
Yeah.
Chetna did this adorable thing where she was like, this is the only way I know how to fry things. And she like pan fried all her donuts.
Oh, heck yeah. No, I definitely.
Which is the cutest and most Chetna thing I've seen all season.
Yeah. And also, speaking of your sort of Dutch history of donuts, one of the donuts that she chose to bake was a South African donut. As we all know, they were colonized by the Dutch. So that's where that comes from.
I was noticing, she made a Coke sister, which is the exact same spelling of the Olia Coke. Any favorites from the tent this week?
Probably Richard's rhubarb and custard donuts in particular, but the toffee and apple ones looked good. Also, I loved Martha's flavor ideas for the lemon and poppy seed and chocolate and passion fruit donuts. Very bummed that those were overproved because it seemed like she had it under control, and I was really excited to see her lamination technique. So it's always a bummer when you're excited and you think that the bake is going to show a lot of finesse, and then something simple happens and just comes in the way of that. And then also Louis' cocktail donuts sounded so good. I love cocktail themed desserts. Ugh, I want to eat them all so bad.
I gotta give a little shout out to my friend Chetna here. I think her flavors are something that I would love to eat, and they looked really cool. She went all out this weekend to do something cool and interesting, and it didn't work out super well for her, but I think her flavors sound so cool.
So true.
No, they're a little bit more basic. They're just chocolate and ginger, but I would eat those in a heartbeat. They looked very cool. They're very different from any other donut the other bakers did. But speaking of different bakes, Martha got a lot of flack from the judges for making her laminated donut dough, which is fascinating. Yeah, they were very.
Like Paul was like, "Oh, that's weird," and then moved on.
I mean, I don't know if it was a lot of flack, but he definitely was like, "That's very strange. I don't know if I trust you in this." And why does that sound weird? Well, this was 2014, and the cronut had literally just been invented, I think, the year before. So cronuts or croissant donuts, so cronut is actually a trademark term. I'm not sure if I should even say it. But what was his name? Ansel in New York made the first croissant donut, and Martha a year later was making one of her own. So now, like, I know of a cronut. Everyone knows what a cronut is. It's so cool to see her doing that way before it was really worldwide.
Yeah, that is cool.
A shame it didn't work out super well, but no, I looked this up because I was like, she's making a cronut. Why has no one ever heard of that?
I literally didn't even think about that when she was like, "I'm laminating my dough." I was like, interesting technique. I think that will be yummy. And I didn't even occur to me that. Yeah.
I don't think she stole it from.
No, it just is another original idea.
It was just a really cool idea. Whenever you see something that like Paul or Mary are like, "This is weird," but I've definitely heard of, I'm just like, wait, how have you not heard of these things that I have? And so sometimes they're a little behind the times, but it's okay because I still love them. Oh, right, I made these.
Yeah. Yeah, you did.
I was like, what am I going to talk about next? Oh, right, I made donuts. Oh my God, Malory. Oh my God, they're so good.
I know. You don't have to tell me. I told you they're literally my favorite food.
I haven't had fried dough in a long time because fried dough is just white flour and it's probably bad for me. But I tried a little like sampler donut when I was starting to fry them. And I threw it in a little bit of sugar just to see what it tastes like. So good.
So good.
Sorry. Anyway, I'm just dreaming of those donuts now. They were delicious. I made a fairly classic donut, a jelly donut with castle sugar on the outside. It was a delicious fried dough. My jam did not work out.
Oh,
and
no,
it went
sad.
everywhere.
What do you think happened?
My problem, I think, was I was supposed to buy jam at the grocery store, forgot, had to go to Target. They only had raspberry preserves.
Not the same.
I tried to push the preserve through a sieve, and it just became this like wet, gloopy mess. And it didn't have the same like rigidity or gelatin that a jam would have. And so I tried to pipe it into the donuts. It just went everywhere. And I was like halfway through, I was like, nope, I can't do this anymore. I took some chocolate frosting that I had left over from some other bake and filled it with that instead. Tasted fine. I loved it. So can't go wrong with chocolate frosting.
Yum.
The donuts, though, themselves, I made this overnight batch of dough, which, yes, would never have worked in the tent, but it spent like 12 or 16 hours just like chilling in the refrigerator.
Yeah, nice.
And it was such a silky, smooth, delicious dough. It made for perfect donut dough.
Wow.
I would definitely make these again in a heartbeat. The one I would not make again in a heartbeat, though I want to try again in the future, is I made French crullers.
Is that how it's pronounced?
Cruller? Yes.
I've been saying cruller in my head all week.
Oh, no. It's definitely cruller.
Oh, LOL.
Oh, yes. So these I've had before. Actually, Dunkin' Donuts has crullers, and I love them. But they're essentially, a French cruller is choux pastry that's dropped into a oil bath and fried. So it's very much like a churro. Yeah, you've said this.
Love them.
And my problem with them is that I'm not sure if I made my choux pastry right. It looked good, but didn't come out very good. It was very soggy. It didn't have the crisp I was looking for. But cover it in enough powdered sugar, really you can't go wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I tried choux for the first time. It, again, did not go well. I will make it again in the future at some point for some other recipe. I'm sure of it. We'll have to perfect my recipe.
I think you should try baking it next time you make it because I can't imagine what it would be like frying it. It really just needs a really long time in the oven to dry out and get as crisp as it does.
I think that was part of the problem, is that it definitely wasn't as crispy. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just a temperature problem. Yeah. It wasn't really as crispy as you would if you baked it. But however, it did have those nice, airy, light insides, like these little pockets of air. That is really cool. So it worked well. Just not my favorite recipe. However, the donut recipe, the jelly donut one, I'll make that over and over again. I'm dreaming of it right now. I want it so badly.
I was trying to think of donuts that I could make to do this challenge justice, and it's hard because really my favorite donuts are sometimes the simplest, like just a simple cake donut with like chocolate frosting, or a simple yeasted glazed donut, or in the fall apple donuts and pumpkin donuts, always my favorite. So I was trying to think about how to do like a yeasted donut but step it up a notch.
You bring up a cake donut and I can't agree with you there.
What?
The only cake donut I want in my life is an apple cider donut because it's perfect, but nothing else.
Oh my gosh, can't relate. I love all of them. I don't discriminate. All donuts are my favorite.
Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of flavors that I could come up with. And I know that I feel like I'm falling into a pattern of fruit with herbs, maybe, or like fruit, but like giving it a little bit of life and making it a little interesting by pairing it with an herb.
That's on brand.
It's so on brand. I know. Whatever. I'll do it this week and then I'll never do it again.
Do it as much as you want. I'm sure it's delicious.
I just think that, like, in my desperate attempt to be original, I'm choosing and I know that these two flavor combinations are like so popular, so really not.
But hard to pull off. So if you pull them off well, I think you'd get a handshake or a head nod or make it through to next week.
Yeah, my ideas were a lemon thyme. So lemon thyme as my first combo, and filling it with like a lemon curd, rolling it in sugar. That would be also like lemon zest and thyme, and probably thyme in the filling as well.
Lots of lemon.
All lemon. And then doing a strawberry basil jam donut. So doing like strawberry basil jam in the middle, and then maybe just like a glaze. A really nice glaze on the front with maybe like little basil leaves to decorate.
I love strawberry jam. Like a lot more than I probably should. I really want to try this. I can't imagine what it would taste like, but it sounds really good.
Basil just adds a little bit, and I've had strawberry basil flavored things before. It really just adds a little bit. I'm trying to think of how to describe it. I don't know. Basil.
Does it like pull off the sweetness a bit?
Yeah, it gives it another layer, which I think is important for both lemon and strawberry, because strawberry is pretty, as much as I love it, can be, especially when it's cooked down to a jam, very one note sweet. And lemon is the same. Lemon can be kind of overwhelmingly sweet and sour. And so just having another very light, delicate flavor requires that, one, you have a delicate hand with those big front runner flavors first, but then also just sort of adds a little cut to them and gives them more complexity. So I think that's why those flavor combinations are so popular and prevalent. I mentioned that Richard's rhubarb and custard donuts were my favorite in the tent this week, and they were clearly the judges as well. Richard, after this week, is Star Baker for the 4th time, killing it. I think all of the bakers are doing fairly well at this point. I think Louie's donuts were also amazing, but Richard was definitely a step above and away, and that showed this week for sure.
However, one of my favorites, they're all my favorites. I keep saying that, but I love her
every week.
Lots.
Another
every week.
One of my favorites.
How
it's
could
so true,
she?
though.
We had to say goodbye to Martha Collison. She is thriving. Oh my gosh.
She's married?
Yep.
I know that's not a symbol of thriving. Trust me, I recognize that, but I just get weirded out, but also excited whenever I find out somebody younger than me is now married.
It's like she's grown.
I know. I'm like, who are you, adult woman?
You can check her out at Martha Collison on Twitter and on Instagram. She has a website called bakingmartha.co.uk. She has written not one, but 2 cookbooks.
Wow.
One of them is called Twist, Creative Ideas to Reinvent Your Baking, and Crave, Brilliant Indulgent Recipes. She writes regularly for Waitrose. She has partnered with companies like Cadbury and Mars and Lindt. She creates new recipes. She makes baking videos. She works with tons of different shows, different organizations. The list goes on and on and on. As you said, she got married in the spring of 2019 to Michael Haywood. She had 8 other bakers there on her wedding day, and many of them, if not all of them maybe, made cakes for her wedding day. I definitely mentioned this in the first episode, and they look so pretty. She had like 12 different cakes on her table. They look perfect. Martha has recently partnered with Bramber Bakehouse, a charity dedicated to restoring women who have experienced sexual exploitation through baking workshops.
Awesome.
So Martha is part of the teaching team, has written recipes for the bakery. That's called Bramber Bakehouse if you want to support them. She's doing a lot of really cool things. Check her out and check out her recipes. We miss you a lot, Martha.
Well, that brings us to the end of our episode today. I hope you enjoyed it. And next week, Entre may be our hardest week yet. It's patisserie week. I'm terrified. I hope you are too.
So am I. I'm so unbelievably scared. As I said, I really want to try entremets, but also like, that sounds so hard.
We'll fight over it. You'll find out next episode. If you have enjoyed what you've heard today, please tell your friends and family to check us out on social media or subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Every subscription and download helps us out tons.
We would love it if you would tweet about us and share how much you liked the show. You can find us on Twitter and on Instagram at HotBowPod, as well as Facebook at facebook.com/HotBowPod. That's HOTBOPOD. The initials of our podcast. You can find links to all of our social media accounts, and you can sign up to be notified whenever we release an episode on our website, hotbowpod.com, or hatsofftobakeoff.com if that's easier. One last time, hotbopod.com.
The links that we use to make our Povitica and our donuts are posted on our websites. You can find them by navigating to episodes and then look for the post for this episode to try out the recipe for yourself. If you do make it, please let us know. We'd love to share with our listeners and also just relish in the joy of the beautiful thing that you've created.
I'd also like to give a hats off to Peter Lilish, who wrote our intro and outro music. You can find Peter on Fiverr as PW Lilish, as well as on Bandcamp under the name AKLF. As Richard says, when I lose my nerve, I'll stick it in the oven. On your marks.
Get set.
Bake! Let me decode my random notes. I literally have and frowny face next to Chetna's donuts. What? Why do I... So beneath donuts, I have Louis and I have his mudslide Irish cream and raspberry mojito with mint. And just below his name, I just have the word cock written for no reason.
You just didn't finish the word cocktail.
Cocktail, thank you. Thank you. I was like, what the fuck, Nick?
I thought you were getting a little thirsty watching this episode. LOL.